is a much more substantial nudge that was used, and you can think of it as another application. So an important decision that we all take is how much to save. And in many countries, including the US, the savings behavior demands interventions from the policymakers. People don't save enough. On an average, people dissave. So one of the issues that policymakers have always been concerned about is how to improve and increase savings. Now, traditional economic theory assumes that each individual have stable, consistent preferences and that she rationally maximizes those preferences given a set of options and beliefs. So how much should I save this year? That depends on the solution of an intertemporal choice problem, which itself is quite complicated. The standard instrument which economists and macroeconomists in particular have used to increase savings in an economy is the interest rate. So if I increase the interest rate, the price, the relative price of my current consumption vis-a-vis my future consumption increases. What does a behavioral economist think of policy instruments related to savings? Matrian and Shia published this very influential paper in which they analyzed savings behavior in a large private sector corporation. When new recruits joined, they had to fill out an enrollment form in which they had to authorize the payroll deduction of their employer contribution, and they also had to select a contribution rate. Further, they had to choose the investment allocation of the combined employee and employer contributions. Matrian and Shia introduced a very simple change in this protocol. Effective from April 1, 1998, all newly hired employees in this corporation were automatically enrolled with a 3% contribution rate allocated entirely to the money market fund. And employees could opt out at any point, particularly when they joined in as a new recruit, and employees could also change the percentage contribution and the investment decision. So in the original setting, the new recruits had to actively decide how much to contribute and where to contribute. In a subsequent setting, the new recruits would contribute by default at the rate of 3%, and the investment destination would be a money market fund. In other words, there was a change in the default investment behavior. There were 4 cohorts in all. The old cohort hired between 4/1/1996 and 3/31/1997, and the default for this cohort was no enrollment. The window cohort hired between 4/1/1997 and 3/31/1998, and the default here was also no enrollment. However, there was a new cohort hired between 4/1/1998 and 3/31/1999, where the default was enrollment in a 3% money market fund. How does the savings behavior change? The 86% of the new cohort participated in this investment plan. However, the number was only 49% for the window cohort and 57% for the old cohort. In other words, the participation rate of the new cohort was substantially higher than the participation rate of either the window cohort or the old cohort. Not only that, the contribution rates were also different. In the window cohort, for example, 63% of the people ended up contributing only 0%. However, in the new cohort, 65% of the ended up contributing 3%, which by the way was the default contribution rate. In other words, both in the window and the new cohort, people were going for the default contribution rates most often. It was just that the default was different. Not only the contribution rate and the likelihood to contribute, but the composition of the investment was also very different. While in the old and the window cohort, about 75% ended up investing in stocks, the corresponding number in the new cohort was only 16%. In the new cohort, the vast majority of the employees were investing in the money market, which was the default investment destination anyway.